Hi everyone, it's Becky here from Ivy's Corner, and I thought I would just do a quick video to wrap up Inktober 2025 and talk a little bit about my experience of tangling through the whole month of Inktober or Inktober Tangles, and just show you my finished pieces basically. So for those of you that don't know, my name's Becky and I am from Ivy's Corner, which is a little corner of the internet dedicated to Zentangle specifically, where I post various courses, lessons, things to do with the Zentangle world. I blog regularly about Zentangle and other kind of mindfulness, art and that sort of thing. So if you don't already follow me, then please feel free to have a little look at the links in the description. Where I have lots of different links to all of my social media. You can buy me a virtual coffee on Ko-fi. You can have a little look at the other work I do, and I would love it if you would hit subscribe and like this video. So without further ado, let me dive in. I'm going to change my camera for you so that I can show you my small book. So I initially started tangling on this small little journal, which was one tangle for every day of Inktober 2025. So I will hop onto my other camera and show you my small book that I tangled along with. If you've been following my videos throughout the month, then you would have seen it, but let's hop across and I'll show you. So here is my desk and here is my little book. Now, I had a lot of questions from people about this book and where it was from and whether I made it myself. I didn't make it myself. It was gifted to me at an event in the UK earlier this year by the lovely Sonali Shah from India. I believe it was handmade by somebody she knows in India. So it's all the way from India. It's this gorgeous handmade book with some, I think, handmade paper, and it is just really beautiful. Now I did struggle a little to tangle into this book because the paper is extremely soft, and so when it came to softening my shading, I found it extremely at times very difficult to kind of shade as much as I would like because the fibres of the paper came away so easily. But I will show you how I got on. So this is my lovely book. It's got this lovely little string around it, so it's keeping it nice and together. And I did decide to do a little cover page to start with, just to test out the paper. There's my little Ivy's Corner logo here as well. So yeah, it was just a little cover page. And the first day we had of Inktober Tangles was Festoon. Now this is an HQ tangle, and this is one that I really enjoy tangling anyway, and I've worked with a lot before. And this tangle I have adapted here to have a slightly inkier space in the centre, and then to have those weighted lines at the edges. I think with the kind of official step out of this tangle with HQ, they have dots around the edges where these kind of just straight lines come out to meet the outer kind of orb shape. But I've adapted it in this way and had a little bit of shading in the centre and around the outside of each of these, as well as overlaying them with some shading as well. But I really like this tangle, and it was a fun one to start the series off with. Now this one I think was really popular on my YouTube and my Instagram, and it was picked up a lot by people watching the video, and I think it's just a really fun tangle by Carla Yoren. It has this really interesting kind of interwoven effect, and it looks really complicated but actually really simple. So it's a super fun one to play with, and I'm definitely going to be exploring using this one more in my work going forward. Day number 3, we had Melvina by Nadine Roller, and this is a really interesting one because it's also really simple, and it's kind of quite graphic, I think, like black and white, and it doesn't have too many intricate kind of delicate little bits. It's quite a bold tangle, and I've tangled it 2 ways here, so once as a border and then once as this kind of star shape in the centre, and both of those are shown in Nadine's Step Out, so I thought I'd have a little play with both of those. There's an awful lot of border tangles in Inktober Tangles 2025, and it's quite interesting to have a play and see how so many of them differ and how you can use different ones. But I also like to try and play to see if I can use certain ones in other ways that are rather than border tangles, and create them as a kind of a standalone tangle too. So we're back to Zentangle HQ for day number 4, and this is Toodles, which is another HQ tangle, and one that I hadn't really tangled all that much prior to doing, I sort of started to tangle with it a little bit more just before Inktober, and obviously now having used it in Inktober, I have come to love it. Now, Toodles is kind of a really organic tangle, and I do like organic tangles, but generally in the past my preference has been more to do kind of more geometric patterns. But I think I'm really embraced drawing this one in this series, and in some of the other lessons that I've done more recently, it's been a really fun one to use. So I kind of enjoy embracing this one. I've kind of layered it up a little bit here. And, you know, I've always said with all of my videos that you can shade them in any way that you like. But, you know, you can. I've chosen here to shade kind of on one side of that central stem. But there's lots of different ways that you can shade this tangle. So next up we had Starlight by Nina Drea Goddard, and this is a fun one that is a nice one to adapt in lots of different ways. It's quite simple, but it really lends itself to lots of different embellishments and things like that. You can really play with this one to kind of create some really pretty work. And I just worked here with some small kind of dots that kind of grew in size or faded away in size, I suppose, and then a little bit more of a bold version here, but really fun one to play with, that one. On day 6, we had Aurivox by Stephanie Jennifer. And this was a really fun one to play with for me because this wasn't one that I would normally kind of be drawn to. I felt it was quite representational and it looks very fox-like, which is obviously the whole point of the tangle. If you read Stephanie's blog about this particular pattern and how she came to create it, it is based on a fox, based on a story about a fox. And it's not something that I would generally do, is to kind of, much prefer kind of the non-representational versions of Zentangle. However, I thought I would play with it a little bit to see how it could look if I drew it as a flower, and it does look this kind of interesting kind of floral shape with the kind of, I suppose, eyes and nose of the fox there kind of turning into maybe the stamen or the central part of a flower. So there's lots of different ways that you can adapt these tangles, and I thought I'd have a little play with a different version for that. So next up on day 7 was Rambles, which is another HQ tangle, and this is one I have drawn lots of times before, but it's one that I often don't feel that confident with, so it was nice to revisit it again. I find it's kind of sometimes hard to make this look ribbon-like and to get my kind of side lines in the right place, but I think it's just a fun one to it's always fun to have a play with tangles that maybe you feel like are not the ones that you're drawn to initially, because then you might find that you really fall in love with them. I really like the embellishments here of just these little dots, and it's a fun tangle to play with for different projects, especially kind of maybe Christmas projects where you can kind of create a ribbon of text if you're making a Christmas card or something like that. So it's a good one to have in your Zentangle repertoire. So day 8 was Cock and Bross, which I found really challenging, and I think a lot of other people did too. It's a very geometric pattern, but it takes a little bit of kind of thought in its construction, and I have a page in my sketchbook somewhere where I really worked through this one lots to try and get it right before I went to record it for my video. I think some of the key things that if you look back at this video when I've tangled it, I talk about making sure some of these lines are parallel, which really helps in the construction of the tangle. But it's a really fun one. It's quite graphic, and you can shade it really nicely to kind of create this really interesting geometric depth. So that's a really fun one by Tanya Ferriol-Cuvert. Number 9, day number 9, was this Lilife pattern, which is kind of like a little grid tangle almost, but creating the grid with these wavy lines. And I think you could also do it as a standalone tangle as well, but really nice, also quite graphic, and I've kind of added this texture on one half here with the shading, which I think looks really effective, and that's a fun one to play with too. We're back to Zentangle HQ again for day number 10, and this is Zenith, and I've kind of done 2 versions of Zenith here, so you can see that I've got these orbs on one side and then these kind of inky dots on the other. So you can kind of have a play with how you adapt this pattern. It looks really fiddly, but it's actually quite simple in its construction, as I suppose many Zentangle patterns are. And then we move on next to day number 11, which is Bee Fly. And this is one, again, that is one of 2 kind of patterns that remind me of butterflies or look a lot like butterflies in this series of patterns that Stephanie Jennifer has put together for us in Inktober Tangles 2025. And Bee Fly is quite a simple with its kind of looping initial strokes, and you can create these really fun little pearl-like dots on the inside. on my large piece, which I'll show you in a moment, I created kind of a double-sided version of this, so it looks a bit more floral rather than kind of specifically butterfly-like, but you can definitely adapt this to be more kind of representational of a butterfly or less representational depending on how you add embellishments and inking in and things like that. So there's lots of options with this one. Obviously here I've added this nice aura around it just to kind of enclose everything and hold it together. And with this one, I took my time when drawing these initial loops and added some auras each time I drew a loop to kind of create this layered effect, which I think looks quite fun. Moving on, and day number 12 is a really fun pattern that I think not everyone necessarily gets on with, but I really enjoyed it. It's quite similar. It's got kind of echoes of other Zentangle HQ patterns like the newer pattern Origin and also a pattern called Flu-ish, which I think was introduced in maybe Project Pack 10, and then the adaptation and tangulation of the Tangle Flu. And it kind of has a lot of kind of like reminders of those two tangles for me. It's a fun one with, here I've kind of grown it out from this central spot, so it's a really nice way to kind of construct this tangle and drawing it like that, and you can add these embellishments here like these orbs with the weighting and things. And in my membership, the Ivy's Corner membership, we actually played with this tangle for one of our weeks, and we kind of layered it with some other patterns as well, and it was a really fun one to try out. And I think not everyone really enjoys this particular pattern, or in my group not everyone enjoyed it, but some people really did. And I think it's nice to kind of try and play with new patterns and kind of help people get to know them and to try out new things. So we used this one in one of our membership sessions, and it was a fun one. I did enjoy this one. I feel like the kind of like organic smoothness of those kind of spirals followed by the tethered auras, really, my hand really liked drawing those. So that was fun for day number 12. Day number 13 is this tangle Mythograph here, which is again one that I haven't explored all that much, although I do have Project Pack number 21, I believe, which is waiting in the wings for me to complete. And Project Pack 21 is all about tangles of a botanical nature, so creating different patterns and growing these plant-like life forms, I suppose, through Zentangle. And this one really made me think I should go back and revisit that project pack, or begin that project pack and bring it to the top of my to-do list, because it was fun to draw this one and I really enjoyed the kind of the layering element of it. One thing I was quite conscious of is that obviously because there are so many layers here where you're adding these different like tendrils, I suppose, of your mythograph underneath the previous ones, you don't want to do anything too teeny tiny, and tangling these patterns really small makes it harder to shade and create that kind of depth and dimension that you want when you begin to do your shading. So using a finer pen was useful here, but I tried not to do anything too small, and it was tricky on my larger piece, which I'll come to in a minute, but I'll point that out in a second. I felt like day 14 was actually kind of similar in construction to day 13 in terms of the mythograph, and it's one that I may actually begin to bring into when I create my Project Pack 21 and follow along with those videos. I might include it in here because I really like the organic nature of it, and growing these almost little seed pods with Skoggy, this pattern here by Annette Rumpler. I love the auras, I love the orbs, and I love the curves and the opportunity to create this depth where these aura lines come together here. It's a really fun one that it really kind of lends itself to shading nicely, and it's a lovely one if you're looking for an organic tangle. So that's one to revisit for sure. Now, day number 15 was Puffle by Sandy Hunter, and this one took me a couple of attempts just to kind of work out. I felt when I first drew it, it wasn't going right, and when I worked out what I was doing wrong, I think it helped. Basically, I was kind of creating more hearts inside this. So I began by drawing this heart shape that kind of mirrored each other on both sides, so this outer kind of wiggly line almost. When I came to draw the auras inside that, I was creating another heart inside, and it wasn't working for me until I kind of really studied the step out and realised that actually I would be creating these kind of separate lobes of this heart shape here, and that really helped when I was drawing this one. And actually really enjoy this one. It's a lovely kind of texture. It doesn't look too much like hearts. I'm not a huge fan of tangles that look like hearts, really. I'm not sure why, but this one I felt was heart-shaped but also kind of disappears and doesn't look too heart-shaped. So I think I might be using this one again in the future. because I did enjoy the texture that it creates and the depth, the kind of almost opposing sides of these, like the points of the heart shapes here, kind of creating mirrored depth and shaded areas. So I enjoyed this one. Day number 16, when we're back to an HQ pattern, and I've given two versions of the Tangle Tripoli here. This is kind of the classic version. The top version here is the one that is often recreated by Zentangle HQ. If you draw Tripoli, often that is what you will draw. But I quite enjoy this other version here. Really, Tripoli is a series of a triangular reticular, which you create and then you can add in shapes inside. And so I thought I'd have a little play around with two different versions of Tripoli here, just to give everyone a couple of options. But both of these options I do really like, and you can create some really, really nice meta patterns from each of them. Day number 17 was Swizzit by Amy Brodie, and this was one that took me a little while to kind of get into the swing of. It is quite similar to some of the other patterns that we've drawn in Inktober Tangles 2025, particularly Olé Olé. I felt it was quite similar to. But what was interesting here is if you read into the backstory of how Amy came up with this tangle, she was trying to draw, or she was drawing Opus by Zentangle HQ, which is a separate pattern entirely, and she had a kind of a what if moment. What if I start drawing this pattern differently, and what would it look like? So in Opus, you're drawing a sort of spirals that kind of come off one side and another. So you do kind of spirals to the right hand side and then spirals to the left in the other direction. And her kind of question that she put to the tangle, I suppose, when she created this one was, what would it do? What would happen if you just drew all of those spirals in the same direction? So in its construction, it's really simple, but it has lots of opportunities for adding embellishments and other different things here. So I've added these little dots around the outside of some of my spirals. I've added weighting to others, and I've added some orbs in between as well. And I think it's a really nice pattern to fill space and add a bit of texture. And it's a fun one to kind of just have a play with, really. If you don't want to think too much about what it is that you're creating, it is a nice one to have a little go with. So day 18 is the Tangle Middleton by Yuru Chen, and this one I like this one because this is one of the only grid tangles we've drawn in Inktober this year. I guess there are other challenges, pattern challenges, where we will specifically be drawing fragments, so perhaps that's why we weren't including too many of those in Stephanie's PDF of tangles this year. But I really like Cubine anyway as a Zentangle HQ pattern, and this really has a lot of elements of Cubine. In fact, if you look at this little square in the corner here, that is Cubine of its own, on its own there in that square. And so just adding these additional little elements here is a really nice way to kind of embellish Cubine, but it becomes its own tangle in its own way as well. I quite like the Art Deco element of it. I think it feels and looks quite like an Art Deco pattern. And obviously you can experiment with mirroring and flipping these fragments, but in this demonstration I've just kept everything in the same direction. So lots of different options for that one, and it's a really nice kind of quite bold and fun pattern to draw. With day 19, we went back to an HQ pattern, and this pattern here is Mirth, which is one that I drew not too long ago for Zentangle Project Pack 27, I think it was, which was all about fragments and reticular. And so when you create fragments and reticular, obviously often you think about creating a square reticular and adding square fragments. That is kind of the standard way that you would start thinking about fragments in Zentangle. But there's a tangle called Pangea, where you draw these kind of wiggly shapes that nestle in next to one another. And Mirth was kind of created from that tangle. It was a filler for Pangea, and it was then it was so cool that they gave it its own name in its own right. So this is Mirth. And I've done two versions of this pattern here. I do like it because it's kind of got this dimensional aspect of it. It's quite similar in a lot of ways to other patterns like Mycelium and Puyang and different versions of those tangles. But I love the kind of the way that these weighted ends kind of invite you to shade in certain ways to give lots of dimension to the tangle. And I also love this alternate version here with this trailing kind of tendrils almost. It kind of looks like a sea creature of some kind. So I enjoyed drawing this one, and I also enjoyed adding this one in particular to my larger piece of work. So I'll show you that shortly. Now for day number 20, this was actually one of my favourite patterns from the whole series. I do love Thomas Pedros Tangles anyway, and this one is, I think, beautiful in its simplicity. Essentially, it is this little fragment here, which is really, really simple. To like a line of an open triangle, which you then draw another inverted triangle inside, and then just fill in these 3 spaces around the outside to create this little fragment of pattern that you can repeat and create in lots of different ways. And I've just added a couple of adaptations of this. So here obviously I've repeated this same fragment around in a star shape, and then here I did this kind of spikier version with an aura inside, and it's fun how you can then add a line on the top and bottom to create another border for this pattern. And then up here obviously something very similar, but just with some more kind of continuing patterns through, and it's just interesting how it starts to look like this pattern is interweaving inside the paper. So really, really fun one, and I think possibly my favourite from the whole collection of 31 tangles this time round. For day 21, we had Butria by Uta Anderson, and this was the other pattern I referred to that was kind of quite butterfly-like in its construction, and you can make this look more or less butterfly-like depending on your preferences. I enjoyed this one, and I think my favourite version of these 3 is this top one here with the inky spaces at the top and around the edges, but I'll come to show you my additional large piece in a second where you can see something else that I tried when I did that pattern. But again, I don't tend to like ones that are too representational, but I think that there are ways that you can adapt this to make it less representational. So this is a really fun one for me. Back to HQ again for Shattuck here. Now when I drew this, I sort of forgot to do the shading. So if you watched my video on this one, you will have spotted me forget to do the shading halfway through, but obviously came back to it afterwards. This is a classic. This is one I've drawn a lot, and I really enjoy this pattern. I've done 2 variations here, so I've done the curved version and also the straight line version. And I actually quite like this straight line version. I find myself tending to draw this version more often than not, but I'm going to start experimenting with this because I really like the way that this just looks like a 3D zigzag. A little bit like Rambles in some ways, with the end of this line disappearing behind it the next. You can kind of see how it's like an overlapping kind of zigzag there. So that was a fun adaptation, but there's lots of different ways that you can kind of add to this and make it look more or less organic, or add the boldness of these inky spaces, almost like Crescent Moon here. There's lots of different ways that you can adapt this pattern, so I encourage you to have a little play with that one. For day 23, this is Kurtaba. I can't remember how to pronounce this one, by Ada Rico. And I actually struggled with this one. This is one of the ones that I struggled with the most in this particular series of Tangles. It took me a little while to get the hang of how I wanted it to look. There's a different way of doing a fragment as well, which I want to explore more in the future. But I've drawn this as a border here and adding in these. I think it was getting the spacing right between the wiggly line initially, and then also making sure I had the space to add in these little delicate elements as well. I found slightly challenging, but it was a fun one when you kind of get the hang of it. And I also really like the inky spaces here, just to add a little bit of drama too. Day 24 was a pattern that I didn't think that I would respond that well to. I've seen it before, I've seen it drawn, I've seen people post about it, but I'd never drawn it myself before. And I was excited to give it a go, having seen a lot of it before. This is Jodie Genovese's Letterish. And actually I really enjoyed putting this one together, more so than I thought that I would. And it's fine, that's interesting. Sometimes there are patterns that I don't think I'm going to enjoy, and then when I come to draw them, I actually really enjoy drawing them. So I think it always just goes to show to you should give things a go. Don't judge a book by its cover, and give those patterns a go that you think don't necessarily appeal to you initially, because you might find one that you really like. So I've tried here not to make the letters look too representational of spelling something out, although I did something a little different in my main large piece. But I really liked the way that you can kind of be random with creating these little spaces in between these shapes that you create to make things look like letters that aren't actually letters. Obviously, some of them do look more like letters than others. Like this is like a B, an S, and an upside down A here. Whereas this one down here, I tried to create something that was, not at all like a letter. So there's different ways that you can add these kind of inky spaces to create shapes, and really letters are just shapes, so it's interesting to kind of try and play around with creating something a little bit different, but also you can use it almost as bubble writing. If you wanted to add some actual text to something that you're creating, this would be a really good option to explore. Ing is next for day number 25, and I think this is a pattern that a lot of people struggle with. It was one of the first ones that I learnt to draw when I started doing Zentangle, and then I sort of didn't draw it for ages, and actually when I came back to drawing it for this, I had to really remind myself how to go about getting it right. I think it's one that sometimes I have to kind of pop back to the step out to remind myself of before I go into it again. And so if you watch my video on this one, I explain about a technique for making sure that you kind of draw the lines in the right way. But I love the dimensionality of this one. It's quite straight lined and geometric, and it's a fun kind of way it kind of wraps around each other. It's like a folded or scrunched up or piece of origami almost. And I've added in some additional kind of elements of embellishment here, these weighted lines to create these petals into alternate triangles. One that I recommend that you have a little go at because it's a fun one. When you kind of get the hang of it, it's a nice one to draw. Day number 26 was Owl Peak by Susan Yo, and this was another fun one, and I've played around here with kind of tessellating it so that you could create these shapes growing off one another. I think the irregularity of these shapes means that it's kind of harder to make them all tessellate properly, but you might be able to do that if you tried a little bit harder. I have, obviously, it's a kind of a six-sided shape, hexagon, because you construct that hexagon with the sides or the kind of outmost points of these spirals, it means it's trickier to kind of tessellate as you might kind of draw a grid of six-sided shapes. But it's a really fun pattern that I enjoyed shading, and I actually really like the way it looks when you lay it all out on the page. So thank you to Susan for this tangle. This is a fun one for day number 26. Now day 27 is Yeed by Midori Furuhashi, and another one that I found really enjoyable to draw because it's quite simple but has this really interesting effect. I love the way that I've shaded the alternating spaces on the outside here. I've added some embellishments of orbs in this border. It's another one that works really nicely as a border. I've also drawn it here as its own kind of standalone tangle in a star or sort of almost snowflake-like shape, and really simply constructed of dots just to start you off with straight lines and these seed shapes as well. So definitely a fun one to explore. Quandary by HQ, another one that I actually haven't really tangled all that much, haven't used in my own work, but one that I certainly will do from now on. I really like it as a texture, and I really like the way that the cushion shading works with it here. It creates this kind of fun background texture, and I love the way that this pattern creates these interesting meta patterns. You can see here where the centre of all of these seed shapes meets. It kind of creates this flower and a circle shape. You can see them appearing everywhere once you start to notice them. They appear from all these different kind of combinations of these seed shapes that sit together. So it's a fun one to explore meta patterns, and also if you're looking for a nice texture, then that's a good one to choose for any tile. Day number 29 is Poke Heart by Henrietta Robin, and this is a fun one for organic tangling. It has its cousins of Poke Root and Poke Leaf by HQ, but adding in this heart shape, and again this is another pattern that is heart but not hearts. You can kind of emphasise the heart elements of this top part as much or as little as you like. It's a nice one to shade and embellish, and yeah, a fun one to add for any organic tangling, or kind of adding into maybe if you're growing a little garden of Zentangle patterns, then that's a nice one to include there. All the way up to day 30 now, and this is Bonus by Angie Gittles. This is a really interesting one it does end up looking quite representational, but I really enjoy the way that it's constructed. It's quite simple, but you kind of wonder how it's been drawn. You can create these kind of elements of a bow. Another one that might be nice to use at Christmas time, or if you're creating a gift for someone or you want to embellish a Christmas card or a greeting card or a label or something like that. It's a pretty tangle that looks quite floral and can look quite floral, but it's a nice one to kind of create that element of representational softness. I think when I've done it in my main project, I've added some little extra texture lines in the top, which really just adds to the look of this as like a gift bow on the top of a present. So a good one if you want something to embellish a gift with, I suppose. And then finally we have Idols by Zentangle HQ. So day number 31 here was Idols, which is a tangle that was created for the International Day of Zentangle, which was a relatively recent addition to the Zentangle calendar. And this tangle, Idols stands for International Day of Zentangle. I enjoy the way this overlaps and creates a lot of depth. You can shade here along these kind of lines that join in together in a similar way to how you would shade something like Betweed as a tangle, or Aeronaut, or all of those kinds of tangles where, you know, you have one line coming from one direction and then is met by another. You're kind of drawing behind. There's a lot of drawing behind with this pattern. And always a fun one to embellish as well with these orbs along the top. But it was a lovely one to finish on with a lovely little collection of Inktober Tangles 2025. So here's my little book all the way through the month. Lots of lovely patterns, lots of different types of patterns, and a little keepsake for me to remember Inktober Tangles 2025. Now, what I'm going to do before I finish this video is I'm going to change my camera and I'm going to show you my large piece, which I was working on throughout Inktober as well. I sat to work on this in kind of chunks. So I started off by tangling the first bunch of days and then I moved on to the next. So let me change my camera and I will be back with you in a second for my large piece of Inktober and I'll talk that through. So here is my desk. I've zoomed my camera, I've lifted my camera up a little bit so you can see more of my desk because I have this lovely piece here. I was working alongside my small sketchbook here. I was working on a large piece of a large Opus tile size piece. So I cut my own paper from some grey paper that I had. Please forgive the masking tape on the sides of my desk here. This is just what I use as a background for drawing so I don't damage my desk. But if you're ready to see it, let's bring in my Inktober piece. Here is my finished Inktober 2025 piece. And what I decided to do for this project was I enjoy doing a large piece when it comes to Inktober. So working small on the individual patterns, but then also working bigger is a nice opportunity. I like to feel like Inktober is a good opportunity to work big and to do a large project and put all these tangles together as a bit of a keepsake, but also as a kind of a challenge to myself as well. So I've previously done the same thing with Inktober in the past. The first year, if you have a little look at my links at the bottom in the description of this video, you will see a link to my Inktober 2023 and 2024 projects. Now my first project, Inktober 2023, was drawn on a large Dreamcatcher string on an Opus tile, and then last year I did an Opus tile, but I really just did some random kind of spacing, drew a random string and filled those tangles in as they wanted to appear on the paper, one at a time. And that one I did blue ink and blue kind of pastel shading. So I wanted to do something a little bit different this time round. I have used watercolour pencils with this, and I have created a spiral. And you can kind of see the spiral. I'll point it out to you now because I've drawn them kind of like a double interweaving spiral with two prongs of the spiral coming out and wrapping around the paper. And you can see here I've got festoon in the centre, front and centre. That was the first pattern that I drew, and I had a circle in the centre of my my paper to begin with as when I drew my string. And then I just hand drew my spiral from there. So I did one spiral coming out one way and then began from the other side and drew my spiral out the other way. If I have some images, I will pop an image on this screen now to show you. And what I have then done is I've added in my tangles. Now I drew in a light grey pen, a light grey 05 pen. I felt like the black was, I don't know, I felt like drawing in the black was I felt quite committal at the point. Like it was like quite a commitment to go straight in with the black. And I wanted to do something a little bit more subtle. So I used this light grey micron when I was drawing my tangles initially. And you can see how I love the way it kind of almost feels like a pencil when you draw on a paper with this grey pen. It's like a permanent pencil basically. And then I'll come on to it later, but I did also then come back in again with my my dark grey 01 micron, and I've added that for some emphasis of line work later down the line, but I'll come on to that in a second. So you can see here that I've worked my way out kind of in 2 different spirals. So we had here festoon, and then seedways here. Melvina was this way. So yes, I've worked with day 1, day 2, and then day 3. Then day 4 was Toodles, day 5 was Starlight, and then I've kind of worked around with, so all the odd numbers around this way, and then all the even numbers are coming around the other way here. So I've got some of my highlights. I suppose I'll talk through some of the highlights of what I liked about this project. I really enjoyed festoon in the centre here. I enjoyed this seedways, which I've drawn. I kind of, when I first drew this one, obviously I hadn't put any of this other tangling around the outside, so I drew my seedways, and then I kind of thought I did a string line taking this off this way, but didn't fill this second part in initially. I knew there was going to be something overlapping, but I wasn't sure what it would be. So I drew my seedways initially up to about here, where my string line was, and then I continued this pattern after I'd finished this section here. And likewise with Malvina, I mean, this one I took straight off of the paper anyway, and I wanted it to kind of bring it, you know, because these were kind of string or ribbon tangles, I felt like it was a nice way to kind of have link the whole project together by letting these come out either side of here and disappear off opposing sides of the piece. So I went through and I tangled all of my different patterns in here. I've got my mythograph here, which I really enjoyed, although it was tricky to kind of lift everything away from its neighbouring tangle at the end. Puffle, I think, looks really nice in this format here. What else did I enjoy? This is Ole Ole was here, and that was a nice one. I've gone for a kind of a wobbly Tripoli here. So I've gone for, it almost has a little bit of an underwater feel. This is something I played with when I did the project pack number 19. That was a kind of a technique used in one of the project pack videos there, or at least it was in someone's piece when it was through the project pack 19 video. And I enjoyed the way that that kind of wobbly Tripoli makes it look a little bit underwater. I've got my mirth over here, which I really enjoyed drawing, and I love highlighting. So I think in a similar way to festoon here, this mirth really with the white pastel that I've added. I have used pastel here because I felt like pastel was behaving slightly in a nicer way for me on top of the aquarelle pencils, rather than the white chalk pencil from Zentangle, which I found quite scratchy, and it wasn't kind of adhering to the paper as well as I'd hoped. So I used white pastel for the highlights. But I really like the way that this kind of the weighted lines around the outside, you can add that highlights on top, and it really gives you that kind of rounded dimensional look. So I enjoyed that very much with the mirth. And here is my Buttria here, which I mentioned earlier in the video. When I drew as a standalone tangle, I did much more of the kind of the butterfly element of it, but I enjoyed here kind of trying to join them all together round in a circle, and I've kind of created this really cool like star shape almost, which I think looks really effective. And I also enjoyed adding a little line of pastel to create some shiny highlights in there as well. And actually that's one of the reasons I used grey paper in the first place, because I really wanted to be able to play with the highlights as well as the shadows. I think it's one of my favourite things about Zentangle, is being able to play with the light and the shade and add those kind of bright highlights as well as the dark shadows. So I knew that I wanted to do something that wasn't just on a white piece of paper. The other patterns I really enjoy drawing on here, you can see here if you spin around that my my letterish actually says Inktober, and there's a little T, Tangles 2025. So I played around with adding actual letters to letterish rather than keeping it kind of abstract, which I quite enjoyed, and I think it doesn't look too obviously like it says Inktober Tangles, but I thought it would be a nice way to kind of have the date in here and remember which year that this project was. Now you can see how my paper has slightly warped. Obviously my approach to this was to go through everything in chunks. So I drew up to, I think it was up to Cock and Bross day number 8, I think that was, and I drew all of that in my grey micron, my light grey micron, and then I went ahead with my aquarelle pencils I decided to use some Brunswick pencils. Here's the other one. These are what I have in my kit anyway. But I really like the way that they work. They have a really nice feel to them. They are easy to kind of to activate and to create beautiful textures and tones on the paper. And so I've used some different colours here. I played around with a piece of paper that had lots of different colours to see what palette I wanted to use for this project, and then settled on the blues and the purples. So I've got, these are the number colours that I've used. So we have a 55, a 36, 77, 72 and a 58 there, which looks very dark, but it's actually just quite a dark blue. So those are all of my aquarelle pencils. And then I went about adding touches of the colour here. I actually really like this colour, which is a kind of a much greyer blue, and you can see that I've used that quite a few places along here. It's for example within some of the this seed rays here, and it's quite a subtle colour when paired with this grey paper, but I really liked the way that looked. It just added a little bit of depth to my creation. But yes, I went about doing my pen work first, my line work, then I added the colour, and I activated the colour by painting the water on top up to day number 8, and then I began to continue the process this way. So I didn't do any shading until right at the end of the project. So I then went all the way around to, I can't remember which day it was, I think I stopped somewhere around possibly Mirth was the last one I did in my second phase. Did all the colour work on that, and then went ahead and did the final stages of the drawing with the pen, and then added the colour, and then went about shading everything. And actually, as often does, that the shading took me quite a long time with this project. I felt like it was quite a big project to work on, and it almost took me a whole day really to work through the final stages of this project. So finishing off the final tangling, adding the colour, and then adding the shading and the highlights at the end as well. And again, it was my white pastel pencil. I used a white pastel Brunswick pencil for my highlights, as well as a Jelly Roll 10 to do a couple of little touches. So my white highlights here, obviously you can see them on the festoon, you can see them here on the Tripoli. In fact, pretty much every tangle has some element of highlighting added to it, rather than just keeping it kind of, I wanted to really play with the light and shade and the dynamics. And with the shading, I went around the first time with a Zentangle pencil, just a regular Zentangle graphite pencil. So I did one pass of shading with this. I went through again with my Nero Extra Soft Cretacolor to add some darker shadows. And then a final pass, I went around the outside of the whole spiral. So I shaded within outside the spiral, so outside the edges of each of the tangles where they met their neighbouring tangles first, as well as adding the shade to the actual patterns themselves. So as an example, which one? So as an example with this puffle here, I shaded around the outside. I also shaded within the actual pattern itself, and then kind of how it meets the other patterns that it's next to as well. And then I went round a third time with some even darker with my layout pencil, my Zentangle layout pencil, to really try and separate the spiral from its neighbours, if you see what I mean. So I wanted to kind of lift the top of the spiral up and separate the patterns in the spiralling kind of string that I've created, so they're lifted on top of each other. And I think that's done a fairly good job. As I mentioned earlier, the final stage for me, as well as adding some little touches of there's not many jelly roll touches in here, just a couple in the middle of the star right there on this on the zenith here. I've added some of the jelly roll, and a couple of touches on the Malvina and on the bee fly here. Just a few little tiny spots, really, nothing too OTT. But then I did also go back through with my dark grey pen to re-emphasise some of the shading and the deeper shadows that I've added. I felt initially I sort of thought I might go back in with the black, and I did start to do that with the festoon, but I just felt the black was too much. There was no other black, there was no other dark ink on this piece, and I felt like the dark grey was slightly subtler but still giving me the kind of the emphasis that I wanted to layer and create different layers between these different tangles. So I went with this colour instead, and actually I think that's why there's a little bit of black in this in the festoon in the centre, and I think that's why it pops out so much more, but that's fine. I'm happy with it doing that because it is the first tangle. It's at sort of at the top of the spiral, so I'm happy with it popping out like that. So went back through and did a little bit of additional pen work with my dark grey pen, and then I did just do a final pass with some extra shade just to really make everything pop. Once I'd added the darker grey, I felt like some of the areas just needed tidying up a little bit, so I went through and just added a final pass of the dark grey and the shading. And that is my final piece. I had so much fun creating this year. I hope you found this video interesting. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe to my channel. I would love to have you here in the future for future videos that I post. I've also recently set up a coffee page, so you can go and buy me a virtual coffee if you enjoyed my video, if you enjoyed any of the videos I created in Inktober Tangles 2025 and they were useful to you. I would love it if you would buy me a virtual coffee and to help support my work, and I will be back with future videos in the not too distant future. You can follow me on all the regular social media channels. I also have courses and lessons available, and of course the Ivy's Corner membership. I'd love to see you there, but thank you so much for watching. I will be back again in no time for the next kind of challenge series. I'm hoping to be back for a fragment of your imagination in January, and there's always other different challenges going on, so watch this space and I will be back to tangle with you again soon.